Today we're going to talk about photosynthesis. This is not a topic that we got to, but is one that could potentially be on the SWL because it is a bigger topic with biology. So I wanted to go over this, and you can take notes and follow along with this. Definition of photosynthesis is a process in which light energy, which comes from the sun, water, and carbon dioxide are used to create glucose for energy. The carbon dioxide is coming from humans, and we put that off, and sometimes there's some in the atmosphere as well. Water is coming from the groundwater or coming from the sky, and we use this to create glucose for energy. And the plants are doing this. And the main goal of photosynthesis is glucose. They don't care about anything else, but they have to eat, and that form of eating for them comes from glucose. This occurs in the chloroplast, and it uses chlorophyll. Photo, as we know from ring roots, means light, and synthesis means to make. And this stems all reactions for life. So what organisms go through photosynthesis? Obviously autotrophs. Auto means self. Troph means to eat. So anything that's an autotroph is going to go through photosynthesis because they have to depend on their own food. We are not autotrophs. We can go get food, forage for food, buy food. So anything that's not an autotroph would go through something else. But autotroph, photosynthesis, make sure you put those together. So things like plants, algae, and then some bacteria that go through the autotroph process. You can see pictures of some algae blooms over here. They're fed from photosynthesis. They can be really detrimental to any sort of body of water because it's really thick and the sun can't get down to the bottom to feed the plants and the animals on the bottom. So you'll see some other plants and algae and bacteria undergoing this process as well. To describe this process of photosynthesis, we would say that's capturing the radiant energy of the sunlight, converting this light energy into a chemical energy known as ATP, and then storing that chemical energy in an organic molecule known as glucose. So if you look at this picture over here, you can see step one, that chloroplast traps the light energy, water enters the leaves, then carbon dioxide enters through the stomata. We'll talk more about that. And then sugar leaves the leaf, and that's that chemical energy that we're looking for. This is the chemical equation for photosynthesis, a pretty important one. You can see that 6 CO2, so 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 waters, will give us glucose, and C6H12O6 is the glucose chemical equation, and then 6O2. Remember, the plant really wants this glucose. It really doesn't care about the oxygen. It's actually a waste product for the plant, but lucky for us, it's a waste product because we need this. And so when we talk about cell respiration, we'll talk about how this equation is kind of flipped a little bit, and how we use that oxygen that's coming out of photosynthesis for our equation. So this is a pretty important one. A lot of people miss these sixes to the equation. If you're good at balancing equations in chemistry, you can do this. But if not, remember, I always tell people 666 is like the bad luck thing. But if you can remember that, you can remember that these sixes go in front of this. This is kind of an interesting graph, one you'll see a lot of when you talk about photosynthesis. The main question asked here is which wavelength or colors of light does chlorophyll absorb the most? What we're looking at here is the visible light spectrum. So this is how we see colors depending on the wavelength. Each wavelength has a color. So you're looking at different chlorophylls in the plant. There's different types of chlorophyll, chlorophyll A, B, and a bunch of other ones too. So you're looking at, does it absorb the most? So here you can see on the y-axis is absorbency. And then along the bottom, you'll see wavelength in nanometers. So like I said, two categories, chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B. So this electromagnetic spectrum, we only see light from 400 to 750. So these are the only ones to see. If we saw this whole wavelength spectrum, if it kept going, we would see microwaves and X-rays and gamma rays. Obviously, we don't see those kind of rays. We see these rays when we look at color and see things. So which wavelength of light does chlorophyll absorb the most? It would be this chlorophyll B right here, about 475 nanometers. So around this blue area. So this is a question, comes from an SOL question actually. It says carotenoids absorb the highest amount of which color wavelength? So you need to find the carotenoids line, so you can see it going through here. Once again, we're looking at light that's absorbed, and we're looking at the colors on the x-axis. So we would look at this, see the highest one, and find that, so it's green. This is actually why plants are green. It's not really the chlorophyll as much as it has to do with the absorbance of light in the wavelength spectrum of the pigments. So we see green plants because it's absorbed and everything else is reflected. So your answer should be green. So some things that affect photosynthesis, one being sunlight, so the amount of sunlight available and the color of the light. Plants do not use green light, they reflect it. There's a really popular experiment where people grow plants in blue lights and red lights, natural light, sunlight, artificial lights, to see how plants grow the best and what color light. But sunlight's a big one. We know that if you hide a plant away in a dark room, it's not going to grow as much as one that gets that sunlight. Temperature is a really big one. As temperature increases, photosynthesis will increase, but only up to a certain point. So higher temperatures mean higher rate of transpiration, which means water loss. So it definitely depends on the temperature. And then the availability of water and carbon dioxide. The chloroplast, always a really interesting thing to learn about. Remember that these have that double membrane. They probably stemmed at one point from another cell and were engulfed by a bigger cell. But this is the chloroplast here, obviously a cartoon drawing to kind of show you a little more, because if we were to look at one that was underneath a microscope, you wouldn't really see this much in detail. So the chloroplast is the organelle which we know that photosynthesis takes place. Obviously, it doesn't take place in animal cells because we don't have a chloroplast. Double membrane, and it's green because it contains chlorophyll. Here, this open area here, this green, is called the stroma. Okay, stroma is kind of like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. This is a thylakoid. This one slice here, but if you were to stack all these together, it's called a granum. The outer membrane and then the inner membrane. And if we look a little more at this granum stack, okay, once again, each thylakoid. So granum is one stack, grana is many stacks. Just know that this takes place in the thylakoid, is where photosynthesis is actually happening, or a process of it that we'll talk about. But these stacks, anytime you see them, granum, each individual one is a thylakoid. This is kind of a tricky thing to learn because it is very different from probably what you've heard of photosynthesis before. But photosynthesis actually occurs in two different stages. If we had long enough in class, we would draw on the tables and we would learn this a little bit more. But we kind of got to learn it the fast way. So it occurs in two stages. We have a light reaction and then a dark reaction. The dark reaction is also called the Calvin cycle. It's a pretty intricate cycle. If you take AP biology, you'll learn a lot about the cycle. It's pretty in-depth. But the light reactions are the photo part of photosynthesis, where light is absorbed by the pigments. The dark reaction is more where the synthesis is happening, and it's trapping that energy from the sun and converting that to chemical energy. So we'll look at a diagram in a second, and you'll kind of be able to see where these are happening at. The first step of the light reaction, we call this light dependent because it depends on light. So it occurs in the thylakoid of the chloroplast. So this is kind of that diagram I'm talking about. Here you can see those thylakoids, another picture there. So light and water are required for this process. Remember, we get the light from the sun and the water from when it rains or groundwater, or when a plant is watered. So it uses water and changes light energy from the sun into chemical energy. This energy will be stored as ATP and NADPH, and oxygen will be released as a waste product. So this light reaction will happen on this left side of this diagram, and you'll see this diagram a lot throughout photosynthesis. So here you see water going in, these are some water molecules, and then you see light coming in as well. What's happening here is that the water is splitting because of light, it splits it. So the oxygen's a product. Okay, so you can see here's your reactants, here's your product. So oxygen's leaving, and then you see ATP and NADPH going over to the Calvin cycle. So here you can know that energy is coming out of this, the ATP. The H that we lost in here, we have O2, but we wonder where did this hydrogen go? It's going to go over here and work in the Calvin cycle. So this NADP coming in, it's blocked by this black marker here, but they would say NADP plus picks up that hydrogen, and it's an electron carrier, and it is carrying it over to this Calvin cycle to be used for this hydrogen. So NADPH is getting taken over the Calvin cycle, and ATP was made in this light reaction. So coming out of this, O2 is the reactant, and we also make ATP and NADPH. Part 2 is the dark reaction, also known as the Calvin cycle. Each turn of this cycle has something going on. It's super, super intricate, but we kind of learn just kind of the surface of this. So it's light independent because this part can operate actually without light. Plants don't need a ton of sunlight. They can store sunlight. They need sunlight for this process, but if they don't have sunlight, they can carry on this process if they have enough ATP and NADPH. So we call this Calvin cycle. Some things call it carbon fixation, but it's occurring in the stroma. So remember that the light reaction was taking place in the thylakoid, and now this other part's taking place in the stroma, which is kind of that chloroplast of the chlorophyll, not chlorophyll. It's the cytoplasm of the chlorophyll, excuse me. So it turns CO2 into glucose. So here we have CO2 coming in, okay? In this cycle, it would be conjoined with that hydrogen that came from the water that got broke down, and ATP is energy, is pushing this cycle to happen as energy to power that cycle. So CO2 combined with that hydrogen is going to give us that glucose molecule, and this is just the C6H12O2 broken down in a more simpler form. So ATP and NADPH molecules created in the light reaction power the production of glucose. So what I told you before, you couldn't really see this NADP plus, so that's what's coming over, picking up that H, and you can see here it has an H on the bottom. ADP is combining this other phosphate so that it's combining it, and now it can be adenosine triphosphate. So both of these get fixed in this light reaction to help the Calvin cycle. But to kind of summarize this, in the light reaction, water is split, oxygen is released, and hydrogen is used in the dark reaction. ATP is formed. In the dark reaction, CO2 is combined with hydrogen from the light reaction. ATP is used from the light reaction. This kind of shows you how ATP is put together. And then glucose is formed. The plant is pretty fascinating. So it has these guard cells on the bottom of the plant. We would see these if you kind of take some clear fingernail polish and some tape, you could actually see these. So they open and close depending on if it has access to materials that it needs. So the exchange of gases, they'll also close when the plant's really dry so that they don't lose any more water. So here you can see one that's open, kind of looks like lips, and then you can see one that's closed. And once it's closed, because it doesn't maybe have enough water or it's not exchanging gas at the time. Here again is that visual. I really like this visual. I think it does a really good job putting things together and kind of summarizing this. Like I said, if we had time, we would draw this on the table and I would come around and we'd talk about it, and you guys would get to know this really well and you'd explain it back to me. But light and water coming in, water is split. So here you can see those little white pieces are part of the hydrogen. So water split, oxygen leaves as a product in the thylakoids. ATP has been fixed and combined to leave, and then that hydrogen is going to get attached to this NADP. So now it's NADPH, and there's your hydrogen. Going over to the Calvin cycle, ATP is powering this Calvin cycle because it's a cycle, and then NADPH is dropping off that hydrogen. The hydrogen combines with the CO2, and it gets fixed to combine to make this glucose. And then ATP is used up, so it goes back to get recharged, and NAD goes back to pick up another hydrogen, and this process keeps going. So what is an autotroph? So an organism makes its own food, a producer, an organism that gets its food from other organisms, or A and B. You should choose D. It's also a producer, plants are producers, and an organism that makes its own food. Remember, auto means self. An example of a heterotroph would be a human. Remember, heterotroph is not autotroph. Heterotrophs cannot make their own food, so we have to go find our food somewhere else. These would be great examples of an autotroph. Auto means self. They have to make their own food. So remember, what is this stack called? The stack is called a granum, okay? Each individual one is a thylakoid, okay? And they do go in the chloroplast, but the stack together is called a granum. The light reaction makes ATP and splits water and releases oxygen. Remember that water is getting split, that's coming in, and oxygen is coming out as a product. And then just a couple more. ATP is used in the dark reaction to convert CO2 to glucose. That's true. The dark reaction requires sunlight. That is false. It can happen in the dark. And after glucose is made, some is stored as starch, and that's true.